The matter here is the issue of authentication in the birth certificate. The ruse is most people make these contentions that apostille is what you do and not authentication. Whereas some people say authentication is all you do and it's not apostille. As always, I'm here to gently break your bubble by letting you know that both ends of the spectrum are wrong. To that thing called the Hague Convention. There are many different conventions by the Hague. But as it comes to the use of documents internationally, whether it be private documents or not. And by the way, the birth certificate is classified as a private document. And by the way, the birth certificate is classified as a private document. And by the way, the birth certificate is classified as a private document. And the pawn is the only chess piece that has the most limited range of motion. When you begin to feud with one another, your range of motion as to whether you can move forward in life, and that same thing that makes you feel so entitled to argue about, that range of motion becomes limited. You become a pawn. You become a sacrificial lamb for someone else to just use as a chess piece to do something else. Think. You must be competent in the age of technology and the luxury you have to search information on the internet. Don't use the pixels on the internet as a detriment to yourself. Learn the reality. Both sides are wrong. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back. It seems there's been quite some recent confusion. I've noticed this a little while back. I surmised when I first heard of this that it would die down. But it seems since human nature is well accustomed to feud and the new conversation, but in form of confusion, there seems to be a rejuvenation of this same simple thing that is quite straightforward. But when those who don't quite get it attempt to engage in intellectual masturbation, they further confuse those with good faith, newly coming in, or those with good faith who have been previously introduced that get more confused. So here are some clarity. Remember, just because you've learned about it before does not mean you have it figured out. A lot of humans use 2 feet to walk every day. But when you take a closer examination as to how they're using that part of their body, you realize it's the same reason why they have back pains and neck pain. A lot of humans carry around the mind. But upon closer observation, you realize the same mind is what they are using to their detriment. It's causing them the pain and suffering that they complain about every day. And a third party is simply looking at them from a different viewpoint saying, just change your mind. Compared to the physical body, the changing of mind might be a little bit difficult. The physical body, you can always look at a mirror. You can always get things scanned. You can always do certain things during certain days in a certain manner and notice, when I do this, this occurs. But the mind is a bit different. The mind is a bit more detailed and far more gentle in the way that it receives and sends information that nonetheless affects the totality of what you are doing. The matter here is the issue of authentication in the birth certificate. The ruse is most people make these contentions that apostille is what you do and not authentication. Whereas some people say authentication is all you do and it's not apostille. As always, I'm here to gently break your bubble by letting you know that both ends of the spectrum are wrong. It is not that all you do is authentication, and it is not that all you have to do is apostille to make anything work relating to the birth certificate. We're going to look at 3 main things. First is that treaty called the Hague Convention. Second is a terminology called legalization. And third are the words from the horse's mouth, one of the states in particularity. But first, we'll go to that term legalization. Page 1050 of John Bouvier's 6th edition. Legalization, the act of making lawful. Now we'll transition to the 2nd volume of Bouvier's Law Dictionary, the Rawls edition. Page 180, legalize, to confirm acts already done. meaning you already have something that exists that's already been preserved, in this case, some pen and paper, more particularly that thing called the birth certificate. The certificate is a piece of paper that's certified that an act took place. In this video, we went over the core of what the birth certificate really is, as it ties to what people usually contend when it comes to how it's a tool on commerce and the good and the bad of it, and how you are involved when it comes to your trust, which directly relates to the Hague Convention, because that Hague Convention also has an agreement based on certain types of trust that are recognized. See, ultimately, the reason why you are dealing with that birth certificate, you're taking it from a county to a state to a federal level, is for the purpose of utilizing it with a trust. That is the part that everyone seems to magically miss when they're stuck with this whole, oh no, it's authentication. Oh no, it's apostille. In short summary, before we go deeper into it, apostille and authentication is a form of legalizing a document. At what level you are doing it determines whether it's called apostille or authentication. And the countries that signed on to that thing called the Hague Convention, there are many different conventions by the Hague, but as it comes to the use of documents internationally, whether it be private documents or not, and by the way, the birth certificate is classified as a private document. And by the way, the birth certificate is classified as a private document. And by the way, the birth certificate is classified as a private document. And we'll be reading that also. If a legalization, aka to confirm act already done, to confirm the act of certifying that someone somewhere was birthed at a location and time, and it was signed by someone else as a witness, either on a county level, being the county clerk or the county recorder, and another party relinquishing any interest attached to that, and all the lunge being the parents. That's what's been confirmed, comma, not to authorize new proceeding in the future, meaning nothing new is being created. When people speak of authentication or apostille or using a birth certificate, this and that, whatever speculation they have attached to what they think reality revolves around in that small box that they've been introduced to, they handle it from a perspective that something new is being done. You are not creating anything new when you authenticate the birth certificate. You are simply formalizing, affirming, confirming through a third party to say the signature in this certificate is exactly what it is. No different than a notary affirms your signature rather than the content of the document. The moment the notary affirms the content of the document, they are creating and authorizing a new proceeding. Instead, all they're doing is affirming an act already done, which is your signature. In the case of you doing authentication of that instrument called the birth certificate in a county, state, and then federal level, all you are doing is confirming the signatory to that document, that a particular seal, aka a signature, aka the seal of the state, aka the seal of the county, seal of whatever entity, exists, and it is acknowledged as being a lawful thing that could be used and accepted as a form of evidence based on the rule of evidence. Which particular rule of evidence are we speaking of? Let's go to federal rules of evidence, which the numbering and the principles are uniform on all state levels. Rule 902, evidence that is self-authenticated. A video was done around 2001, 2002 on YouTube regarding self-authenticating evidence. This video's thumbnail. Whenever you authenticate or apostille a document, the blanket term for that is called legalization, or to legalize. To legalize is to confirm act already done. Legalization is the act of making lawful. Why are you making a document lawful? The reason why you're making a document lawful is because that particular document might not be acknowledged by a foreign jurisdiction. But in order, the process, the operation of law, aka legal, page 177, that which is according to law, that's his first definition. Meaning, in order for you to now use that same document in a way that's acknowledged according to law in whatever foreign jurisdiction you are intending to use that same document, in this case, the birth certificate, although you can legalize, aka authenticate, aka apostille, any document. Did I just use apostille and authenticate synonymous? Yep, I just did. But there's a qualifying factor that makes them synonymous because they're both a form of legalization. Legal is in according to law. If you intend to use any particular document in a foreign jurisdiction in a manner where they acknowledge it as holding the same power as it would in whatever original jurisdiction or the origin of where you brought that legal document, it has to go through something called legalization, aka you have to legalize it. The act of making lawful. By legalization is also understood the act by which a judge or competent officer by legalization is also understood the act by which a judge or competent officer authenticates a record. Let me zoom this in so you see what I'm saying here. By legalization is also understood the act by which a judge or competent officer authenticates a record or other matter in order that the same may be lawfully read in evidence. In other words, the act of legalization, aka the act of authentication, aka the act of apostille, which is a stepping stone to authentication. If it's not clear at this point, apostille is just one step below authentication. Authentication takes it all the way to federal. Apostille stops on a state level. That's the foundational difference between apostille and authentication. But nonetheless, they are both a form of legalization. Authentication takes it all the way to federal. Apostille stops on a state level. That's the foundational difference between apostille and authentication. But nonetheless, they are both a form of legalization. Authentication takes it all the way to federal. Apostille stops on a state level. That's the foundational difference between apostille and authentication. But nonetheless, they are both a form of legalization because the intent is to use it in a foreign jurisdiction outside of the origin of said particular document. By getting a competent officer, aka someone who witnesses oaths or the validity of document. And since the state and federal are their own jurisdiction, they have their own respective officers within their organization and hierarchy and departments that perform the act of witnessing and attesting documents as being authentic, as being real. When you intend to use a document internationally, according to some countries, you have to take it to federal level. When you intend to utilize a document internationally, according to some countries, you apostille it. And that is where this thing called the Hague Convention comes in. Certain parties, aka certain countries, acted as signatories, meaning they consented to it. Others did not. Those particular countries that accepted the Hague Convention are known as apostille countries, meaning they said, in order for you to use these documents in our country, you don't have to take it to federal level because we acknowledge the sovereign power, the sovereign immunity of each state. Therefore, so long as you just legalize it up to a state level, we'll accept it. That's called an apostille. The countries that did not sign the Hague Convention said, it's cool that the states have their sovereign immunity, but we still want you to do it all the way to federal level before we can accept it as being valid aka as evidence of whatever you say you want to use it as. That's called authentication. Legalization, aka authentication, aka apostille, depending on the level you're going, state or federal. State being apostille, federal being authentication. Legalization is a format, a mannerism, an etiquette, a quorum of evidence based on that which is self-authenticating. Meaning the moment you have those seals from these other body politic on the state or federal level, by way of their officers that have the power to attest the authenticity of documents, it becomes self-authenticating, as though they are there next to you when you're presenting that document to foreign entities or foreign interests, commercial or otherwise, that this is exactly what I say it is, without me having to argue you down. Look, here's their seal saying that it is what it is. And based on which state that you're going, some of them require you to stop on a state level, aka Secretary of State, within your respective states. Some of them require you to go to the federal level, aka the Department of State, on the United States level. If you're going to the countries that are signatory to the Hague Convention, when it comes to legalization of documents, it's called apostille. When you're going to nation states or countries or corporations or commercial interests that did not sign the Hague Convention when it comes to legalization of document, it's called authentication. Based on rules of evidence that makes that particular document that you're legalizing, whatever hierarchy you're doing it on, that makes that document self-authenticated. These things are so simple that videos are not really required to be made on it. But when you start to see people intellectually masturbate and start arguing and start feuding amongst one another, the same everyday man that needs solution, that's suffering, getting dinged, barely know the basics of how commerce works. If you ask them what appreciation, depreciation, amortization is, if you ask them the basics of how to use trust to make monies without being dinged, if you ask them the basics of how to do certain spiritual things in a manner that's not speculative, they're dumbfounded. Yet, here they are arguing amongst themselves about some speculations where both of them are wrong. One is saying authenticating is the only thing you do to make the birth certificate work. The other is saying apostille is the only thing, because they've listened to two different people who are spouting two different things. And thus, of course, since most people in today's world are followers, they unequivocally and blindly follow what they hear and use that as a form of sect issue, whereby if someone says something contrary, it is the end of the extreme to theirs and they must attack it. That's the state of mind of a pawn within a chess piece. This piece right here, you see it? This right here. Whenever people do that crap and they don't even realize that what they're feuding against one another is neither right nor wrong. But what is wrong is the fact that they are feuding against one another and they both need clarity. And what's right is for them to realize how they can come together and make it work. It's always worked since time immemorial. It's the basic principles and art of war. The way pawns are made is to make themselves attack one another. That is why chess pieces are the closest pieces on the chessboard to one another. The further back you go on the board, the stronger the pieces get in terms of control of the playing field. Those who win chess pieces knows to be cautious in sacrificing the same stronger piece on their end for an equivalent piece on the other end. Meaning bishop for bishop, queen for queen. They know that that usually leaves a wider door open in the house of the one who made such move of taking equivalent piece. The turning point usually comes immediately after an equivalent high value piece is sacrificed. But the one who goes after that, they benefit if they think and observe the field well enough. But when a pawn takes out a knight, a queen, tower, then you know that you have done an excellent job. That's called a return on investment. You used a smaller piece to take out a higher one. The issue is that most pawns are stuck. They have no choice but to take one another out solely based on how they are designed and conditioned to function on the chess piece. When you remain in contention among one another about things that you both have minute awareness of, you then both place yourselves in the position of a pawn. While you are busy eating one another's flesh, the little box within that chess piece the pawn has left is occupied by the stronger pieces behind them. Because while you're busy eating your flesh, you get taken out of the game completely. And that box that pawns move in limited frames, those boxes are occupied by the stronger pieces behind the pawn. Only when the pawn leaves the board, the other pieces behind them. There's a reason why those stronger pieces are behind the pawn. And they cannot move unless the pawn paves the way, opens the path. No matter how wide they can travel, no matter how much turns or loopholes they can take with a chessboard. Only when the pawn is out of the way can they fully extend their reach and exercise the power that they have. But so long as that pawn is there, they will always be behind the pawn. But once the pawn is done eating itself, if you've ever noticed, the pawns are close to one another, so they usually have no choice but to fight one another. The moment those pawns choose not to fight one another, they stagnate the capacity of all those other strong pieces behind them. Yet, there's enough space in between the pawns on the opposite sides for the pawns to do what they do on the board and move freely. Pay attention to a chessboard. It's telling you a story about how society works. Only when the pawn leaves the board are the other pieces behind them are able to move free and exercise their power on the board. Now, we're not even looking at the attribute of a king similar to a pawn. But that's an entirely different story. Nonetheless, think. Stop being a pawn. The playing field by default benefits you because the operation of how the game itself begins is designed to allow pawns to move freely while still restricting the movement of everyone else behind them. Think. Simple as that. And the pawn is the only chess piece that has the most limited range of motion. When you begin to feud with one another, your range of motion as to whether you can move forward in life, and that same thing that makes you feel so entitled to argue about, that range of motion becomes limited. You become a pawn. You become a sacrificial lamb for someone else to just use as a chess piece to do something else. Think. You must be competent in the age of technology and the luxury you have to search information on the internet. Don't use the pixels on the internet as a detriment to yourself. Learn the reality. Both sides are wrong. Rule of evidence. Remember, legalization tells you that it's done by an officer to make an act in that document lawful, to be admitted as evidence. Rule of evidence self-authenticating documents tell you 902 item number 2, domestic public documents that are not sealed but are signed and certified. A document that bears no seal if it bears the signature of an officer or employee of an entity named in Rule 902(1)(a) and another public officer who has a seal and official duties within the same entity certifies under seal or its equivalent that the signer has official capacity and that the signature is genuine. This is what is being done when you do it on a county level. And since the incorporation doctrine makes the 50 states the same as the United States, similarly, this is what is being done. Another public officer, as it shows here in legalization, a competent officer, another public officer with a seal and official duties within the same entity, meaning incorporation doctrine, is attesting to someone else's, another officer's seal to say, yes, the signature is genuine. Because the signature prior to theirs is saying this act took place. Therefore, all that needs to be validated in order for it to be an evidence of the act that the certificate mentions is just the signature of the initial one who said the act took place. Therefore, when you keep legalizing it as a stepping stone, a stagger stone, up to another level, the only thing that they are attesting to, its validity, is not the event, it's the signature. Because one signature from the beginning already attested to the validity of the event itself. Therefore, the only thing required to be attested to is just the signature of another officer by another officer. (902) Item number 3, foreign public document. Remember, the birth certificate is actually a private document. But whatever you can do publicly, it is derived from one given private right. Just as much as a public right can be privatized. For instance, tort. Those on Patreon know how that works. A document that purports to be signed or attested by a person who is authorized by a foreign country's law to do so. This foreign country's law to do so is the Hague Convention. Now keep in mind, there are many Hague Conventions, some on trust, some on use of vehicles, but particularly the one on legalization. And that foreign country's law says that, look, instead of us creating different individual laws in our individual nation states that might confuse people, we'll just come together under this international treaty where everyone can look at it as on one center of information, as one reference point to see whether they need to legalize up to a state level or legalize up to a federal level based on what we've accepted. A document that purports to be signed or attested by a person who is authorized by a foreign country's law to do so. And based on that Hague Convention on legalization, all they require is the power of the Secretary of State. Again, if it's an appeal, Secretary of State on the state level. If it's an authentication, aka the people that did not sign the Hague Convention, it's the Secretary of State on the federal level. These are the simple, easy, clear dots that people don't add before they start arguing about one thing or the other. Ever too often, our brothers turn against brothers, sisters turn against sisters over some stupid speculations that is easy to comprehend, all because both parties arguing just don't get it clearly themselves. Why do they not get it clearly themselves? Because they've just followed the hype train. Just because someone presents something with a hype and a sparkle and glitter behind it, doesn't mean that man or woman themselves really figured it out. And if they did, it doesn't really mean you listening to them really figured it out. Because they might realize it, but the question is, after you listen to them, did you get it? Because if you really did, there will be no need for you to contend or argue with anyone else. This is for the purpose of clarity, to realize that both sides are wrong, because there are subtle intricacies right in the middle that balances the scale. What you see is not always the totality or the limits of what something is. The detriment is all these people that carry all these large PDFs, thousands of pages, all these documents, all these pictures of books. These basic things are readily available and they don't read it. And when they read it, they don't see it because they lack the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is the substance that's not necessarily spoken, yet if you read it, you see it clearly and it speaks to you clearly. The spirit of the law is your ability to connect the dots beyond what someone else is telling you. The spirit of the law is the reality and the function of things beyond speculation. These things are far easier than people make it. The document must be accompanied by a final certification. Again, if it's apostille, that'll be on a state level, Secretary of State. If it's authentication, it'll be on a federal level. Whoever you're stopping at is the final certification that certifies the genuineness of the signatures and official position of the signer or attester, just exactly how legalization tells you. Or of any foreign official whose certificate of genuineness relates to the signature of the attestation or is in a chain of certificates of genuineness relating to the signature or attestation. This chain of certification is when you take it from county to state to federal. Simple. Because the chain of certification is only certifying the signature rather than the content itself. Simple. The certification may be made by a Secretary of United States Embassy or legation, by a Consul General, Vice Consul or Consul Agent of the United States, or by diplomatic or consular official of the foreign country. And by the way, this Consul General is in the Department of State, in case it's not clear. Or consular office of the foreign country assigned or accredited to the United States, meaning the competent officer who is able to authenticate a record. Why? So that it may be lawfully read in evidence. Evidence, rule of evidence. Evidence, right? Evidence, Rule of evidence breaks it down to you in details. If you really want to comprehend how the birth certificate works, if you really want to comprehend the most basic baby steps as to why you're authenticating the birth certificate, and the reason why I'm saying the purpose of it is so that you can use it as the holder before you start making others the holder in due course. Read Rule 902, evidence that is self-authenticated, and it will clarify a lot to you. Now let's hear it from the horse's mouth. From the Maryland Secretary of State. There are several types of certifications. Remember, certification is just a piece of paper that says, hey, something took place here, and that's really what it is. Therefore, I sign using the power of my office to say this is right and this is what took place. Then you take whoever signed based on the power of their office, and then you go legalize it through whatever hierarchy. But on the base level, certifications, aka the birth certificate, it's just a party saying, yep, this man or woman was born during this day. Yep, this male or female was born during this day, this time. This is the mother. This is the county to which the child was recorded in the vital statistics. Again, we went over the details of the true function and the reality behind vital statistics on the Patreon page in this video. So the clerk states all that basic information. Okay, the birth certificate. And the Maryland Secretary of State is saying there are several types of certifications processed in the Office of the Secretary of State, which certify the incumbency of persons in the governor's appointment to various commissions and cabinet positions, elected officials, and portions of the annotated Code of Maryland. Now, I could have went to the other part of this that speaks about the Hague Treaty, which we'll read, but I particularly stopped to read this part as an introduction to how you can actually compel governors to act to do certain things. Because the Secretary of State of the state level, Department of State on the state level, holds certain certificates as to the power and how the governor was accepted. If you've watched the video on mandamus, so far it's been 3 parts. It's going to be 5 different parts explaining particular things when it comes to it. And these are the 3 parts I've played on Patreon. You can also use mandamus on the governor for certain things. So I'm introducing this when it comes to the power of the Secretary of State, because I know most people on Patreon also watch these videos on YouTube. So by the time we get to that stage of development of things, you'll have been readily introduced to these basic principles, and it will make more sense as to the reason why you're contacting the Department of State or Secretary of State to do certain things when it comes to holding a governor by the balls. So since that process deals with certification, and this video also deals with certification, I'm taking this particular portion of this video to just point this out. Now let's go back to the portion of legalization, authentication, and apostille. And here is the core. Whether or not a country will accept the apostille form of certification. Apostille is a form of certification. This website of Secretary of State in Maryland makes it very clear that apostille is just a form of certification, meaning there's more than one form of certification. If you're saying apostille is all that there is to it, or authentication is all that there is, you're still delusional and you're still lying to yourself. Your delusion should not be the source or the reason why you are disputing with someone that you can be coming together with to make life better for yourself and your posterity. according to the Secretary of State of Maryland, whether or not a country, the country being one of the people who signed the Hague Convention or not, whether or not a country will accept the apostille form of certification depends on whether that country signed the Hague Treaty. Convention is another word for treaty. Whether or not a country will accept the apostille form of certification depends on whether that country signed the Hague Treaty. The Hague Treaty is an international treaty agreeing to accept the signatures of the Secretary of State of each state without having it certified by the U.S. Secretary of State. This just clarified the speculation as to whether apostille or authentication is the way to go. Apostille is a form of legalization. It's a form of certification. It's a form of attesting that a signature is true and correct, based on which country you say you're using it at. Authentication is the exact same thing if you intend to use it at a country that did not sign the Hague Treaty. It is that simple. No need for us to give ourselves headaches on foundational things when clarity is the mother of all truths. When you're introduced to any information, the first few moments, weeks, months, and I dare to say the first few years of you being introduced to any given information is not the confines of that information. It is not the totality of truth of that information until you gain clarity on the sophistication, the details, the intricacies, the subtleties of that information. You just have something in your hand as a tool that you've yet to know how to use. And that leads to a lot of trouble, a lot of intellectual masturbation, and a lot of unnecessary feud where you should be spending the same energy fixing your life's problem, moving a step closer to what you really want rather than distracting yourself with trash. Information is meant to be used to better your life, not to make you more confused and more convoluted, or to be used as a subject matter to argue with someone because your real life is miserable. Cut that crap out. Now let's end this with something that sounds good to the ears. Life is about balance. It's bitter, it's sweet, but nonetheless, they both work together. Here's something that I'm sure most of you would like to hear. And it's the fact that the birth certificate is a private document. Here is an organization that assists people engage in authentication and apostille for use at an international level. And they acknowledge the fact that the birth certificate is a private document. Most states consider first of all, that a birth certificate is a private document. But let's reiterate that most states consider the birth certificate a private document. They said it twice in case you didn't get it the first time. Meaning whenever all these entities are authenticated on a state level or on a federal level, they are well aware that what they are authenticating is a private document. It's good to hear, isn't it? So now when you are taking rules of evidence and you are legalizing a private document for it to be used as though it's the original, that means you are taking something into your own hands and there's a lot of power to it. You're taking one step at a time to privatization of something that's used like a harlot, directly and indirectly. Did you know that the process of obtaining a certified copy of a birth certificate also differs from each state? Each state has different requirements. Also, each purpose may have a special form to fill out. What about use in a foreign country? Then a certified copy with a raised seal will be required as it can pertain to legal issues or identification. This legal issue or identification is what we just went over. The uncertified copy cannot be used for foreign issues or legal or identification purposes. To this last part, the question now is, if legalization, certification, aka apostille, aka authentication, if it is for the purpose of use in a foreign country, because every time you authenticate or do an apostille, depending on where you stop, they would always ask you which country you're using it for. That should tell you automatically that it has something to do with foreign affairs. Here now is the question that I will propose to you that's far more important than any speculation or question that you might have came across when it comes to the matter of birth certificate authentication, or whatever it is you want to call it. Are you really going to be using that birth certificate in another country? And if you want to truly be the holder of that private document called the birth certificate, are you going to have to learn how international commerce works? Are you going to have to learn how trust and international law governing trust works? If you're just doing this and you just put in random foreign countries just to get the document to say, I have it authenticated, so I'm doing something special. But you missed the entire point that you did in fact mention a foreign country. Do you not realize that you're gradually stepping into international laws? The question you should be asking yourself is, are you prepared for international affairs? Otherwise, the authentication of birth certificate will do you no good. You're just piling up a lot of papers. Ask yourself that question. Begin to be realistic with yourself when it comes to this whole birth certificate thing. Remember, many will seek and they will not find because they're stuck on speculation. And the beginning to get an answer is to ask questions. And the best one to pose a question to is always yourself. When you learn an information, seek clarity in that information rather than just taking the information as the end of the totality. Begin to ask yourself questions. There's more to what everyone have been introduced to when it comes to this whole birth certificate rhetoric. And 9, if not 10 out of 10 people in all these venues on social media will not ever get to it. These are not harsh words. This is not to be mean. It is just the reality. If you think I'm wrong, you just sit back and relax and keep watching years go by after the other, after the other, after the other. And see if those who have introduced the whole thing with authentication of birth certificate really show you the subtle substance of it. Question yourself so that you know where you're coming from and where you are going. But how can you ever question yourself as to where you're coming and where you're going if you don't even know the basic clarity involved in what you're doing, such as what apostille is and what authentication is, and the fact that they are the same thing, merely based on which level you stop doing the certification or legalization. And where you stop is based on which country you intend to use it at. Which country you intend to use it at are the ones that either signed the Hague Treaty or not. Ask yourself that question. See, the reason why I always end all these videos with that phrase, best of luck, is because I'm well aware out of every 100 people that listen to these videos, 98% of them will need luck to get there. Until next time, take care. Best of luck.